Today we're going to talk a little bit about watercolor and painting and some techniques that you might use in our upcoming projects. Watercolor is pretty low maintenance and cheap, honestly, compared to other paints like oils or acrylics, in which case some oils can cost 20 bucks a tube, which is just insane. But watercolors are also easy to manipulate and change once they're on a page, which for most types of paint, that's not really an option. So, for today's lesson and your first assignment with watercolors, we're going to learn how to use them as well as how to use your brushes most effectively. Your paint palettes don't look like this one. This one is my personal one, and these are some of my brushes specifically. Now you'll notice that the bristles of my brushes are stained. The ones on the right are stained a little blue-green, and the ones on the left are pure white. They were all white at one point, but now they're different, and that's okay. Staining bristles isn't the end of the world. Leaving paint in your bristles so that the bristles don't bend properly is the end of the world, however, like I mentioned in class. Setting up your workstation is also pretty important. You guys are going to need a few things, mainly paper towels. Paper towels are always important, but you're also going to need 2 cups of clean water. Yes, 2. One of these cups is going to be for clean water, and the other one is going to be for dirty water. You will always rinse off your dirty brush in one, and then rinse it off again in your clean one, just to make sure that there's no more pigment left in the bristles. This also allows you to use that clean water for certain techniques that will be required with watercolor. So always make sure that you have those 2. The paper towel is just for blotting and drying out your brush as needed, and also sometimes for cleaning up messes. Once you have your space set up, you need to start by laying down your paper. And people at home, you don't have to do this, but for people in the classroom at least, I will be giving you a board and access to painter's tape, this blue stuff. This is really good for blocking paint and or water and stopping it from going anywhere that it shouldn't. Because paper, when it gets wet, buckles a little bit, which we don't want. Watercolor paper is less prone to buckling because it's made for this, but still doesn't hurt to be cautious. So with your painter's tape, you're going to tape down all edges of your page. And if you're at home, you can use regular masking tape or something, or you can just tape the corners if you so choose. I like to do it edge to edge because it gives me a little 1/4 inch white border when I'm completely done with my piece, which can honestly look pretty nice. Working edge to edge with watercolors is not always great. So I'm going to dip my brush in one of my waters first off. They're both clean, so I'm designating this one as my clean one for right now. And I'm just going to gently tap the side of that. Now notice that I'm not stabbing the tips of the bristles into the paint, and look at how far up the paint goes. If you start getting paint up into the very, very far end of the bristles near the metal ferrule, stop what you're doing, go wash your brush right away. It's never a good idea to pack paint in there. But I'm tapping it on its side onto the cake in the pan. This prevents the bristles from being bent or broken. Now a brush is tapered, meaning it gets narrow at the end and pretty fat toward the middle. A brush also tapers when you press with it. So if you have really light pressure, you can get a nice thin line, versus when you press down, you can get a pretty thick line. And then when you lift off again, and this is key, it will narrow out again. Always pay attention to the pressure with your brush. This is not a pencil. You can fill in large areas by swiping kind of back and forth using the side of the bristles a bit. I'm still keeping an angle. I'm not holding this like a pencil though. I am holding this by the handle at the end. Don't hold this close to the tip or the bristles like a pencil. Watercolor value, or the lightness and darkness, or even just the intensity of the shade, is determined by how much water you have in addition to your pigment. The more pigment you have, the darker and or more vibrant the shade will be, versus if you have a lot of water and very little pigment, in which case you'll have a really light color. Now I'm doing something called wet and wet right there, where I add water to it and then I gently touch the edges with pigment to kind of bleed it out a little bit. Similarly, once watercolor is applied to a page, you can move it to a certain degree. Like I said, watercolor is pretty forgiving. It accepts mistakes, and you can change things and move them around. You can redistribute the pigment just by adding a little bit of water to it if you don't like specifically where something is placed. On really good watercolor paper, you can like stick it in the shower for 10 minutes and then dry it out and reuse it again, like a whiteboard. It's wild. Make your paint strokes carefully. Every single one of them should matter. As you can see, I'm just kind of scribbling that out from side to side very lightly, adding more water as I want it to get paler and more of a gradient. I'm going to turn my workspace really quick so I can kind of zoom in and get a better angle on this, because we are going to start the next section, which is your assignment. You have to emulate the following techniques that I'm going to demonstrate, and the first one that we're going to mess with is a flat wash. A flat wash is, simply put, a flat wash of color, just a single thin layer of color applied evenly across a space. So I'm using one of my flat brushes for this. You guys don't have one of these. A round brush works just the same. But as long as you apply your pigment evenly across the entire space, you're good to go. It's a flat wash. This is good for skies and large areas and base coats, because watercolor always needs to be layered. Now, a graded wash is, well, a gradient form of wash. I'm going to start by laying down just water and then gradually adding some really dark pigment. And once I have just the end filled in with some of the pigment, I'm going to use the water that's already there to spread it out. I'm going to use my round brush and kind of scribble that in just a bit. You can almost get a sketched look. And add a bit more pigment to the left and blend that in just a bit more. Again, if you want to keep blending, just add some water, add some pigment until you get the right balance. But a graded wash should be much darker or vibrant at one end than the other. The other should almost be just paper, very, very light. So combining colors with watercolor is easier than you'd think. You guys need to know a little bit of color theory for this, so if you need to refer back to that, check the video on my channel. But for right now, I'm just adding some red and yellow to make orange. Just kind of blending it into the wet pieces that are already there, and scribbling it in with a little bit of water and my brush. Keep in mind, I am not adding a lot of pigment. My specific pan of watercolors are incredibly pigmented, so I have to be kind of careful to not overdo it. If you ever end up adding too much pigment or water to your page, dry your brush out, blot it dry, and then you can almost soak up some of that moisture or pigment that is on the page, provided that it's still wet. It's kind of a little get out of jail free card. I notice how dirty my left water is getting versus my clean. Always keep those two waters on hand. The next technique we're going to talk about is dry on wet. Now, the page for this has to be dry first, but then I get my brush wet and dip it into my paints, work up a little bit of a pigment, and then I apply it to the page. This goes on pretty thick and pretty full coverage, but it is still easy to blend other colors into it. Now, wet in wet is another method where I wet the page first, and then I apply my wet pigment on top of that, and it kind of bleeds out almost like ink, and it'll spread into that wet area. You always have to be careful about wet areas touching other wet areas, because they will bleed together. If you want to maintain sharp edges, be patient, wait for things to dry, then go over them later. Wet in wet is messy and hard to control, but if you can define your edges carefully, you're pretty good to go. Now, dry brush is another technique that is good for heavy textures, things like grass, trees, things like that. Dry brush is what happens when you apply almost dry paint with a very low water content to a completely dry page. You can really see the texture of the paper beneath it, you can kind of get an interesting coverage there. Rather than a wispy watercolor look, you get more of a traditional paint stroke. You can go back and add a little bit of water to it to get more of a complete look and fill in some empty areas, but dry brush, again, is just really good for textures. Now the last one is one of the most interesting methods. It's not commonly used for some people. Some people can't stand it, they don't like the imprecision, but I think it's really neat. And this is the salt method. If you have a wash laid down, just with some decent colors, let's say you're doing a snowy valley or even some grass, you can add salt to your watercolor. If you just sprinkle it on there very lightly, notice how it immediately pulls the pigment toward the granule of salt. This can create a really interesting texture, especially once it's dried, but the only issue is that it has to dry. If you're doing the salt technique, you have to be prepared to wait a little bit, because eventually you have to brush the salt off, but if you do it too soon, you'll smear the paint, because it's still wet. So if you do the salt technique, I recommend that you wet your page, do the section that you need, salt it, and then let it sit overnight so that it can properly cure, and then in the morning, brush that salt off with your finger. And here I have an example of what the salted section looks like when it's done. You have a really interesting receded texture to the section of green here. These techniques are the things that you need to do for your assignment. I'll list them here on this page so that you don't forget one. If you need to, check the description below for timestamps to see which ones you specifically need or how to do them, and we'll be going through these in class as well, and I'll be able to assist. With luck, by the end of the week we should get into painting fruit and using references and identifying colors and complementary color schemes within fruit. So, good luck. I will be around in class to help you guys and assist with this.